Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. Today we're joined by Steve Goodburn and Neil Munns-Jones, both directors and founders of MDJ2. Steve's background primarily at Woolworths and B&Q, and Neil's again at B&Q and Friedland. Neil is also the author of The Reluctant Networker, which I believe is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. Hi guys.
Hi.
Hi, Simon.
So it'd be good, maybe Steve, start with you if you want to give a bit more background on your work history.
Yeah, sure. So I've been consulting for 10 years now with Neil on a variety of projects. But prior to that, I spent 30 years working in retail, and the first sort of 15 years or so as store manager and various size stores and area manager, and then moved into the head office environment where I was largely responsible for change initiatives, either in retail in the stores or in supply chain or in commercial or whatever function I worked in. So all of my jobs have been, in the last 15 years of proper work, have been involved with change and helping people through change. So that's kind of what I do.
Amazing. And Neil, a bit more on your background?
Yeah, so I've got a bit more of a eclectic background. So started out in banking and then worked at Kingfisher in the early 90s, but more in head office. I did a year at B&Q in store ops, and then worked in manufacturing for 6 years where productivity was a huge part of our agenda. We were manufacturing the doorbells up in the northwest of England and facing a lot of Far East Chinese competition. So cost reduction and productivity was a huge challenge and priority for us, and then ended up back at Kingfisher and worked at B&Q in commercial, where I met Steve.
And just tell us briefly about the book celebrating its 10th anniversary.
Oh, so yes, The Reluctant Networker, as the title suggests. So I am a reluctant networker, but what I've learned along the way is just because you're reluctant doesn't mean you have to be ineffective. So I've become an effective reluctant networker, and now it's a bit of a sideline, but it's nice to do a lot of talks and workshops for working professionals, but also for students, just to get them into good habits about networking. Certainly from MDJ2's point of view, all our work, if it isn't from existing clients, all new business comes from all our efforts at networking.
Yeah, never underestimate the power of a network. Today we're going to talk about the importance of engaging people in productivity change initiatives, something we've all been involved in different guises, retail and outside of retail. We'll start with you, Stephen. The big question: what are the key elements for success in your mind?
I think if I reflect on store operations and retail operations, which is probably where the bulk of the productivity initiatives that I've been involved in, they broadly split into three headings. There's a sort of scheduling, contract changes, full-time, part-time mix, restructuring type activity. There's process improvements in the ways of working, so how people do things and is there a more efficient way. And then the third element would be customer service, so getting your colleagues in the stores to be interested in customers and customer service, perhaps moving away from task. For all of those things, the key element for success for me is whatever change you're trying to make has to be logical in their world. So not in your world. So your world is probably based in head office where you've come up with a bright idea to get people to change what they do. That change, however, when you roll it out, will be perfectly logical to you in your head office environment, looking at the world from that perspective. But if you're at the front line, the communications come down, often filtered through the part. It has to be logical to you in the world in which you're living. If you don't have that cohesion, if you don't have that logic, whatever initiative you do will fail, because people will naturally revert to their normal operation or the normal way of working. So for me, that logical piece is the critical piece. If you think about what's important to me in my world, well, often it's what my boss thinks is important. So if my immediate boss thinks it's important, then one element of that will be to I will make that a priority for myself. If my immediate boss has other priorities, then funny old thing, my priorities will follow that. So therefore, buy-in and leadership buy-in, particularly from regional management, is important. So it's all about that logical thing. If you take it up a level and get out of retail and think the biggest change initiative in my lifetime is the COVID response that the government's been leading. That's, if you think about it, on a mass scale, they've implemented change to 70 million people's ways of life, and a very significant change. Why has that happened? Well, it's happened because it's been logical to each of those individuals. So why has it been logical to those individuals? Well, it's been logical largely through fear. If you tell me that if I leave the house, I'll either die or I'll kill my grandmother, well, funny old thing, I'm going to take that very seriously. If you then supplement that with the ability to stay at home and still earn money through the various schemes the government's implemented, I've removed that other need for me to leave the house. So that's, largely why a combination of government initiatives and media stories and all that, why the whole nation has moved, completely changed their way of working. And why have they done it? Because it's logical in their world. The challenge the government will have going forward is, having created those new habits and created that fear, how do I actually move back from that and get to, a more normal way of life as things change? And that will be very difficult, I think, and will take a lot of time. So it'll be fascinating on a macro level to see how that change goes out. The principle of that being logical, I think, it reflects on any change initiative, whether you're talking about retail productivity or you're talking about, changing behaviour on a mass scale. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, some really good examples there. I like the perspective bit, because we've all worked in head offices, and I always find that reality of let's talk about a process, centrally can be very, very different to the reality of the people performing that process, whether that's the steps, how long it takes, when it happens, who it involves. Yeah,
so I'll give you a micro example, having gone from COVID down into something sort of much more trivial. On one of the customer service initiatives that I led in a big retailer, they had salesmen that were selling some of their products they sold, and in this case it was kitchens, absolutely needed an assisted sale. You needed to be guided through the process of selling. And that is obviously taking a lead from the customer, being interested in the customer, and then either passing it over to a specialist, or if you happen to be the specialist, then taking it through to close the sale. Very important thing. So that first contact with the customer as they walked onto the display area was absolutely crucial. So to try and understand what real life was, we did some secret undercover videoing. So we had some people posing as customers, walking onto the display area at various times of day in various stores, and then being filmed in that first interaction. So what actually happened? We ended up with hours and hours and hours of video. And this is back in the days of VHS. And I literally spent all night, one night, watching these videos, on sort of double speed, so it wasn't quite so boring. Almost never did we see an interaction that we at the head office level would have deemed appropriate. And then the worst example was a lady who walked onto the plinth, and a slightly sweaty sales assistant, she went up to him and said, "Oh, can you help me?" And he turned around quite abruptly, said, "Yes, what do you want?" Says, "Well, I want to buy a kitchen." And then he sort of walked away from her, saying, "Well, I don't know, what type of kitchen do you want to buy? You have to think about, blah, 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 blah." And she was trailing along after him, saying, and at one point actually said, "I can't hear you," as he walked away. So it's a dreadful, dreadful, dreadful example. And when I played that to the area managers to say, "Look, this is a reality of what's happening in our shops," they were all affronted and were all wanted to rush off and fire this guy because he clearly was, not following what the company required. But then when you got into his world and said, well, why would that have actually happened? He was the only person in that area. It was an evening, and he was given a list of tasks to do by the store manager and was going to be judged on whether all of these tasks, physical tasks, had been done, cleaning, tidying up, whatever. Nowhere on that list of tasks was customer service. So this lady was absolutely an interruption to him being able to complete his work list and be valued. So in his world, it was absolutely logical to avoid customers at all costs and to crack on with the work, because that's the way the game had been set up for him. It wasn't intended, it wasn't what the business wanted to do, but it was the reality on the ground. So again, in his world, it was logical for him to behave in the way that he was. In the head office's world and the manager's world, it wasn't logical at all. It wasn't what they intended to happen. So it's a silly example, but it's quite important that as you set things up, you need to think through what are the outcomes that you want, and then how do I make those outcomes logical for the people that are carrying out the work. And that would involve changing measurement, changing the way that people are rewarded, changing the tasks that people are expected to do, changing the way that they're judged, changing the way they're trained. A whole bunch of activities, none of which in this case was happening for this poor individual.
It just reminded me, it was certainly one of the times when I worked in stores and I'd come from head office and we were given this, and this a bit like you was going back in the day because we got a fact. The task was every Sunday we had to report back to head office and data. And having been in head office, I completely understood the rationale. It was a really sensible thing to be asking stores to do. I can't remember what the data was. It would be really useful information to have. Working in the store, there was no way we could gather that data. It was completely impractical. And so what did we all do? Instead of going, that's a silly thing to ask, it's meaningless, we just made the numbers up and faxed them back, because you'd get a bollocking if you didn't report back your numbers every Sunday. And
Sunday probably wasn't the best day to do it anyway, because it was probably one of the busier trading days, I assume.
Yes, I certainly had my share of experiences of being the duty manager on a Sunday, and then someone from head office, the director, turns up and wants a tour, and yes, you'd rather be getting on with doing all your other tasks.
Yeah, it's interesting, Steve. You said the response when you showed the field leadership the video was to go and fire the guy.
Yeah. I had filmed a lot of hours of video. We made a sort of edited highlights video and showed it at a conference. And the regional managers were all completely in denial. So not in my stores, that wouldn't happen, blah, blah, blah. So there was no way that team of people were going to take accountability for what was happening, and that they claimed it was, in an attempt to try and move the dial forward, it actually failed because, again, I wasn't in their world. So if you're a regional manager, the last thing you're going to do is say, oh, yeah, I can see that happening in my stores. I probably ought to do something about it. That would be a fast way to the dole queue. So again, I hadn't thought through the impact of using that video on that team in terms of getting them to change the behaviours they needed. So again, we hadn't referred back to what would be logical. So I've described in detail what the logic was for the individual on the sales floor. But you then have to think, well, what's the logic for the store manager? What's the logic for the regional manager? How do I then drive those changes in behaviour that I need? And in my experience, often that comes back to a purpose. I know you've done podcasts on purpose, Simon. Mm-hmm. But the most successful change initiatives link back to a purpose that is understood by the business and is held top to bottom. So the most successful retailers have that clarity of purpose. Then you can hang your change initiatives off that, and because it feeds back to a central theme, it becomes much more logical at all levels of the organisation for whatever change you need to take place. So I could give you a couple of examples where I've seen purpose in real life, both in America, actually, both in large out-of-town stores in America. The first one was we were in this store on a sort of visit, and we saw someone sweeping the floor. We were chatting to them, and we said, well, what's your job then? Kind of expecting them to say, well, I'm responsible for keeping the place clean and tidy. And his response was, my job's to drive sales. I mean, I really weren't expecting him to say that. So when you drive sales, you're holding a broom. So no, it's my job to obviously make the presentation of the store as good as it can be. And along the way, if I see a customer, I'll ask if I can help them and link them up with the right people and all that sort of stuff. Oh, well, why do you do that? Well, because we talk about sales every day. We've got targets by area. It's important the whole team is part of delivering against that target. We also happen to have mystery shop checks that make sure we're doing the right thing. So the whole infrastructure had been set around a need to drive sales. And even the guy holding the broom was really clear on their purpose, wasn't sweeping the floor, it was to drive sales, which I thought was remarkable in the sense that it was a random meeting with a random guy in a very, very large chain of stores. Yet they'd inculcated that culture through the business, through a purpose, which in that case was drive sales, help customers. Was their essential purpose.
It's the same as the guy who sweeps the floor at NASA, and a bit like your story, they ask him what he's doing and he's putting a man on the moon.
Exactly the same principle, but having that common purpose through the organisation. So again, if you get back into productivity, well, why the hell do I want to work more efficiently? Is that actually in my interest to work more efficiently? Well, explain to me why that's in my interest and why I should be doing that and why I should care. I mean, you can do that with carrots, you can do that with sticks, but either way about, there needs to be a reason for it. Another example, self-checkout. We all know about self-checkout now. A lot of retailers are using it. When it started back in the day, again, I did a trip to the US to look at how it was being implemented in a store chain. And we did 2 stores on the same day and looked at the operation. And in both cases, they had appointed a person to sort of be the captain, as they think they called it, for that group of self-checkout operations. So essentially, one person would be looking after 4 tills. Customers would be taking themselves through the tills, and this person would be steering them through and problem solving and all that sort of stuff. And the first store we went to, the experience was fantastic. It was a young guy, was really committed to the project, brilliant customer service, thought the thing was a wonderful, idea, both from efficiency and from a customer service perspective, and really was on top of it. And the thing was flying. It was really, really impressive. The second store we went to, an older lady was taking that role. And we asked her about it, and she said it was a terrible idea. The union should be up in arms about it. It's just a way of taking jobs from the assistants. I tell people to go and queue up over there where there's a real person that can serve them. These things are the work of the devil sort of thing. Well, you can imagine how it was working in that store. And that same initiative, same chain of stores, but the attitude of the individual was entirely different because their logic was different. Her logic was protect jobs, unionized kind of thing. The other guy's logic was this is great, it's better customer service, and it's going to help the business move forward. I'm not saying either one was right or wrong, but they were very, very different, and the outcomes, therefore, were completely different. Again, when we took that learning back into the UK as we started implementing these sorts of things, the criticality of that captain role and them being really clear on why you were doing it and the benefits and all that sort of stuff and believing in the project was crucial to making it work. And did we get that everywhere? Absolutely not. I failed to land the criticality of that role. Everybody was more fascinated by the technology and the techie bit. It was much more about the human bit and how do you make this thing land.
Prevalent in lots of projects within retail and outside of retail. Once it becomes a tech project, not a people project, which has tech, you tend to see all that softer stuff of logic, leadership buy-in, the cascade of information disappear because, like you say, people love a bit of fancy tech. It's tangible, you can touch it, you know how much you're paying for it. The fact that you may not have engaged people and come from their viewpoint into how to drive the return on investment on it becomes a byproduct of the fact it's shiny and new and looks great and we're all excited about it.
It's easy in the test stores or the first stores you do, or if you're an owner-managed business, it's very, very easy to make these sorts of changes because you can control it, you can get your arms around it, you believe it yourself. It's much, much more challenging when you're trying to roll out across, in Woolworths' case, 800 stores, or a large-scale chain of any scale. That getting that scale change to land is much, much more challenging.
Very few people that get it right all the time. Neil, I know Steve and I have talked retail there in detail. Outside of retail, the same principles apply, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one of the things I learned when I ran the manufacturing business up in the Northwest, and we had launched a couple of years earlier a continuous improvement, lean program. And the thing that struck us where we really got some mileage was when we sort of effectively kind of turned the program over to each of the teams. And so we started out in the first couple of years where it was just some top-down initiatives, and we trained everybody on process mapping and, delivered a few big projects that gave us some good cost savings. But after sort of a couple of years where the guys really started to get it and we trusted them and empowered them, we got to a position where we used to, when we did the budget every year, so before we'd even started the year, we could put about 3% cost reduction into our budgets without any clue where that was going to come from. And that all came from, 5, 10, 15, hundreds of tiny little projects that would just sort of bubble up through the course of the year because we'd empowered the teams. Yes, we'd given them the tools and the common language. What was interesting was our role as the leadership team was to motivate them to. There's some nice. I quite like the guys Kouzes and Posner. They have their 5 attributes of key leaders, and a couple of the ones that were really relevant here. One's called encouraging the heart, so motivating people, and then the second bit is enabling others to act. So rather than the leadership team being the experts who we know all the answers, it was about removing the obstacles and the barriers to let the teams get on with it. Because what I've learned in all businesses that I've worked in retail and manufacturing, the people doing the work know how to fix it best, and management actually really got a clue. And we just got a lot more traction when we kind of got out of the way, and we did. Some of the ways we encouraged the heart was my ops director and I. We used to go and work once a quarter. We'd pick one of the lines, go and work there for a few hours, and just have a bit of a laugh. And I remember the work study guy came along one time and tried to time us with his stopwatch, and he laughed after a bit and said, "I think I better go get my calendar, not my stopwatch. You guys are so slow." But as I said, it was we genuinely didn't know how to improve the process, but our job was to motivate. And one of the things we did, we gave each of the teams a little budget to so if you need a bit of money to change the line. And the amazing thing was they hardly spent any money, and it wasn't because they didn't have any ideas. They treated the money as if it was their own budget, and they'd just come up with low-cost ways, no-cost ways to improve their processes. So I would say it's really quite transformational and a real change to the way I viewed leadership, which was sort of top-down, command and control. We're the experts, and we tell everybody how to do things.
Yeah, that challenge culture is interesting, and we've talked about it with a number of people on different podcasts, and comes back to some of your points, Steve, about purpose. If you've got a clear purpose that's brought in and people can challenge upwards, I'm always amazed when we work with businesses how many of those ideas are already within from the people that do the job day in, day out, but can't get their voice heard, or management suppress the ideas because, as we talked about at the start, the view of the world centrally is different from the perspective and the reality of that person doing that particular task.
Yeah, we did. So I think one of the first projects Steve and I worked on together when we were consulting was an organisation design project. And we talked to the sponsor, so it was his team, and he said, he told us what change that he thought he needed, but he said, "I'm not sure the team can cope with all this change." And so we said, "Well, look, let's go talk to the guys and see what they say." And it was amazing. They were all like, "Well, of course we need to do it. It's absolutely the right thing to do. We'll be able to cope." And we, armed with that information, went back to the sponsor and were like, "No, it is going to work." But it was amazing that he didn't really trust his people, and yet they knew the answer and they were committed and were willing to make the changes.
We've done a tour of retail and looked outside of retail, and those themes are common and exist across both, around getting the right people doing the right things on the right hours and the right hierarchy, the process improvements, ways of working in the service. How, in your minds, do you balance that, let's call it process improvement for want of a better word, versus customer service?
Well, from my point of view, it's very difficult. Many retailers, particularly if you like, the self-service retailers, they are very task-focused. So all of their KPIs are around task. And if you then want to inject some customer service over and above that, it can be very difficult, particularly if it's, again, not logical, not measured, not important locally. So it can be very challenging. It's much easier if the local leaders are passionate themselves about service. So often it will come back to the local leadership, either at store level or the level above, and how important those elements are to them, versus having shiny shops with stock all faced up. And so, yeah, it's always a challenge getting that balance, often because labour budgets are tight, and to just get the task done is challenging with the budget available. So if you then start overlaying, and by the way, can you be pleasant to people and spend time with customers, it becomes a very, very difficult thing.
I think there's also a sort of personality / capability issue here in that, and you can see it depending on the kind of retailer. Some retailers are very task and process focused and they don't need a lot of customer service. Others, it is all about the customer interaction. But if you want to, I've not met many perfect store managers. And when I say perfect, I mean the ones that can do both of the things we've just talked about. So they're fantastic at all of the task stuff, but are also very motivating and create a culture that is, that encourages staff to interact and be good at customer service. And of course, there are some very good ones, but as Steve alluded to, when you've got an estate of hundreds of stores, it's quite difficult to get people to cover all of the stores that have both of those sets of skills, because it's quite different.
I think the forgotten, in my mind at times, group is that field leadership group that sit somewhere in between the support centre and stores or warehouses or contact centres, wherever they might be. Because you mentioned it before, Steve, what's important to my leader is important to me, and that does cascade down. So if they're inevitably missed out, not engaged in the journey, and they'll all have their own agendas and nuances of ways of managing, it becomes very difficult then to drive that consistency, which ultimately, wherever you work, you want minimal variation across process and maximum consistency, because that's where you get your biggest gains. So the more variance, the different it is for a customer. So I could walk into shop A in Southampton near you, Steve, and shop B in Shrewsbury near me. As a customer, if the brand's the same, my expectation is the same. It doesn't matter that I'm in Southampton or Shrewsbury. Yeah, actually, they could be very different for a number of different reasons. Leadership, training, development, all the softer stuff, maybe even layout, fit, investment. That's the holy grail, I think, at times. And the missing link is often that field piece, because they get the view across the different units.
I agree completely. And there's two ways, essentially, retailers can tackle that. One way is you enforce a rigid cookie cutter approach to the whole operation. So you see that in fast food outlets, where it is the same experience no matter where in the world you are, never mind in the UK, because everything is completely standardized and there is no allowance for any move from the centrally imposed plan. So there are fast food's an example of that you see, but also you can see some retailers operate that model. So there is no local or regional variation. It is centrally controlled. It does stifle innovation, but it can be a very efficient way of working. It is less easy to do in a high service culture or if you've got large variability. The second option is, as you say, to put a lot of energy and time into that regional management population to make sure that they're all working in a common way. They have similar values and similar abilities. And that will often require some level of restructuring and then an awful lot of investment in time. But that investment will pay off because they are the critical people.
And those two models, I think, either drive very different cultures or are driven by very different cultures, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the first one is absolutely about process. So you employ people who are very good at managing process and making that happen. If you want more of a sales selling service type thing, then you employ different sorts of people with a different skill set.
And you must have seen that as well, Neil, outside of a retail environment.
Yeah, I think as just repeating a bit what I said before, I think that is like there's a tendency to try to come up with this sort of ideal role, whether it's a store manager, a regional manager, and we have to recognise we're all human beings and we've got different skill sets. And so, I think as Steve said, it's good to understand what is our kind of primary culture here. You see it in retail. There are some businesses that are primarily about task, and fast food's a great example at one extreme, and therefore you hire a certain kind of person. So I think it's and that would be the same in I've done quite a bit of work in the mining industry, and that's about as far removed from retail as you can get. But the challenges around productivity, if you want to drive a productivity agenda and engaging people, the challenges are exactly the same.
It's been a fascinating chat, guys. One question for you both that we're asking everybody on the podcast before we wrap up is, what's the best bit of business advice you've ever been given?
Okay, thanks for putting us on the spot there. I think probably the wisest bit of advice I got, and I still don't like it, but it is absolutely spot on, is it's all about focusing on outcomes, not about activity. So, it's very easy to keep yourself incredibly busy, but you've actually got to be focusing on, are you getting the outcomes?
Yeah, I like that.
Some of the focus.
It's good. Steve?
Well, just building on what Neil said, I think many times you can confuse activity with progress. So the natural instinct, particularly in retail, I find, is people want to do stuff, and they want to do stuff quickly because that's the way they've been successful. But often you can find that all of that activity isn't delivering the outcome you want. And to go back to my original point about making things logical for people in their world, you can put all sorts of activity into trying to change stuff, but if it's not logical, it won't land. So put some time and some thought into what will make it logical, and you've got a better chance of getting it to that.
Amazing. If people want to find out more about MDJ2 and what you guys do, because it's not all about productivity, you look at marketing and customer strategy and planning, do some program management, organizational design and effectiveness, and some commercial strategy work, they can find you at mdj2.co.uk. And you're both on LinkedIn, yeah?
Yeah, we're on LinkedIn. As a reluctant networker, yes, it would be remiss of me not to be on LinkedIn, but to use it on a regular basis. So yeah, we're both on LinkedIn.
Thanks for joining us, guys. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Thanks, Simon.
Remember, plenty of editing on that, I think.